Squats are bad for hypertrophy. You guys are going to have to bear with me. My voice still isn't back. We've been over that. So, I keep seeing this claim, and I hear this claim, even from bodybuilders, that squats aren't good for hypertrophy. And there's a Twitter thread that's getting hot that I don't really care about because I'm not actually on Twitter, but people repost their stuff on Instagram and then I see it. And the point being that, if you're not built to squat, then squats are bad for hypertrophy and you should be doing all these other things instead. So let's examine that for a minute and ask ourselves, are squats bad for hypertrophy? I think the obvious answer to this is no, because it doesn't make sense. Squats are bad for hypertrophy. What are we trying to say here? Squats are bad for hypertrophy of what? Like, squats are bad for hypertrophy of the VMO. Squats are bad for hypertrophy of the glutes. Squats are bad for hypertrophy of the hamstrings. Like, where are we going with this? It's like if I said to you, bench press is bad for hypertrophy. Of what? Your legs? Yeah, I would agree. Bench pressing is not going to give you huge quads. Similarly, we might say deadlifts are bad for hypertrophy, right? And then someone makes some argument that, hamstring curls would result in more hypertrophy of the hamstrings than a deadlift. Not that I even agree with that, but, this is the type of argument that gets made, and it's a stupid argument. It's a weak argument. So, squats are bad for hypertrophy. You're better off doing very quad dominant exercises like leg extensions and, hack squats and a hack squat machine at that, right? And I fully disagree because you didn't define what muscle we're trying to hypertrophy. So right there, that doesn't make any sense. So if I told you, squats aren't great for your adductor, you should do a movement that's specific to the adductor. Now we've defined the muscle group that we're targeting. Does this make sense? I hope this makes sense to you. Like, I'm not trying to be pedantic. I'm trying to be very specific. That if you're going to make a comment and say, squats aren't good for hypertrophy, hypertrophy of what? Okay? So, very quickly then, we can also say, what type of squat? Are we talking a high bar back squat? That's going to target your quads more. A low bar back squat, that's obviously going to have a lot more posterior chain in it than a high bar back squat. But maybe we're talking about a front squat. And a front squat is obviously going to target your quads far more than the high bar back squat or the low bar back squat. So suddenly, different types of squats target different muscle groups just due to joint angles and, just which muscle groups are going to be worked by the fact that we're changing where the load is placed. And not to get too far off on this, because this really shouldn't be a long discussion. You look at these different pro bodybuilders even. I love listening to these guys. I don't do bodybuilding. I have no aspirations to ever compete in bodybuilding, but I do find it really interesting to listen to some of their stories of how they went from one thing to another, and why they changed this thing. I might have been Dusty Hanshaw. If I got it wrong, then I apologize. But there was one of them, I think it was Dusty Hanshaw, that's why I said Dusty Hanshaw, who commented that he never saw people tear a pec doing dumbbell bench presses. And so he was commenting how a dumbbell bench press is a better movement for a bodybuilder than a straight barbell. And that makes perfect sense. Now, don't get me wrong, if I'm playing offensive line, I want to do a close grip bench press. Why? Because you play with your hands right in front of you. So it tends to be a situation where you want to get strong in certain areas. Doing a wide grip bench press isn't going to be the same as doing a close grip bench press. And, if we're not competing in powerlifting, why do you need to do a powerlifting style anything? You don't. You don't need to do a powerlifting style squat. You can do front squats and build your legs. The point being, you listen to these guys talk and they're like, yeah, this is why I changed. I can't remember who it was. There was someone, I feel like Paul Barnett interviewed someone, and I apologize for not being able to remember the individual's name. but they commented on how they had suffered an injury. And so, because of having suffered the injury, they don't bench press anymore. That makes sense. There was another guy, and might have also been on another Paul Barnett one, where he was talking about how he does hack squats because he injured himself doing back squats. He was previously doing powerlifting and got injured, and after his injury, he had to change things. Well, then that makes sense to me. All of us have to change things after an injury or due to an injury. I have a disease that is eating my wrist, apparently, and so I can't snatch. It's not because I don't want to snatch. I love snatch. It's my favorite lift, actually. Unfortunately, I can't do it, so I have to train around it. So, back to squats and hypertrophy. This is my point that I want to illustrate to you. I don't care who you're looking at. Right? If you're looking at Flex Wheeler, Jay Cutler, Ronnie Coleman, Lee Haney, Nick Walker, Big Rammy, Derek Lunsford, whoever it is, okay? All of these guys built their size initially, regardless of what they do now. They built their size initially doing heavy squats, heavy deadlifts, heavy rows, and heavy presses, okay? It's power building, as you commonly refer to it. You look at any of these guys, Mike Mentzer, Dorian Yates, Tom Platz, okay? You can't compare what someone's doing 10, 15 years deep into their career to what they did in the beginning, especially if you right now you're watching this and you weigh less than 200 pounds and you're nowhere near 300 pounds, okay? It's like that Dave Lamartina. I love him. What a savage. You have to start somewhere. So I think Justin Harris had a whole series of I can't remember what it's called, like super heavyweight or something like that. They're just doing DC training, but they're doing it with heavy squats, heavy deadlifts, heavy presses. That is how you build the mass. So you right now watching this, maybe you weigh, 170 pounds and you want to be huge. You're going to get there by doing heavy squats. So you can't tell me doing squats is bad for hypertrophy. Every single bodybuilder, every single big power lifter, etc., they all did big, heavy movements in the beginning. So they did heavy squats, they did heavy deadlifts, they did heavy presses, and they did heavy pulls. And the point to this is that these large compound movements, like a squat, do in fact build hypertrophy. Whether or not you love him or hate him, Paul Carter, okay, he made a comment once about how if you can't squat 315 for reps, you're wasting your time doing isolation movements and unilateral work. It's a valid point, okay? If you're at the point where now you're doing 10 sets of 10 with 405, you're squatting 405 for 100 reps in a workout, go ahead and start working on other things like leg extensions, hamstring curls, hack squats, pendulum squats, etc., so that you're able to train certain muscle groups. Maybe you look at your legs and you're like, oh gosh, I'd look better on stage. I'm not a bodybuilder. I'd look better on stage if I had thicker adductors because it would give me a wider quad sweep or something, okay? If that's the point that you're at, yeah, you probably need that isolation work. But for most people, you don't have enough size, period. So, it's like guys that obsess over, well, this movement works the rear delt, and this works the side delt, and this works the front delt. And it's like, dude, just fucking press. You don't have any shoulders in the first place. You don't have any size. So just getting bigger is going to make it, it's going to make everything bigger. If you get your press up to the point where you're pressing 315, okay, overhead press 315, you're going to have big shoulders. So if you can overhead press 315, now maybe it's worth you spending time doing a whole bunch of, rear delt work or something like that to create symmetry and all this stuff like that. I'm not a bodybuilder. This is not bodybuilding advice. I'm just making the point that big compound movements like squats are going to make you bigger, they're going to produce hypertrophy. Is it going to, optimally make your adductor look better, or in your VMO you're going to get that nice teardrop? No. But right now you have pencils for legs, so put on some size first. And this is why I find it weird. People will say things like, well, squats are bad for hypertrophy. And it's like, that is utter bullshit. Man, it always comes from some guy who is skinny. So some skinny dude who has no muscle mass at all is telling you not to squat. Or it comes from some guy who is huge, and he has been huge for a very long time, and now he forgets what he had to do in the beginning to get there. He forgets the fact that he spent the first 10 years doing heavy back squats. So you have to look at how someone got to where they are. Like, this is like people that want to train like Lou, or they want to train like Klokov. And it's like, well, can you snatch 200? No? Okay, then you're not where they are. Or in Lou's case, are you snatching 160, 170, whatever? The point being, okay, if you aren't snatching double body weight, you need to look at how they got there instead of what they're doing currently. Okay, this is like Brian Carroll. Brian Carroll squats 1,306, 308, something insane. It's over 1,300 pounds. Okay, and he talks about how he only goes heavy once every 10 days. I believe that is completely true. However, you need to go heavy more frequently, because right now your max back squat is a whopping 405. Okay, so whenever you're squatting 1,300 pounds, yes, you also can train heavy once every 10 days. But if you're only squatting 405 right now, you're going to need to train more often and heavy, relatively heavy, more often. It's just the way it is. So you have to look at, what did he do back whenever he was squatting 405. I bet he didn't go heavy only twice a month when he was squatting 405. Okay? So back to this whole thing, squats are bad for hypertrophy. Sure, if you're that late stage in your career where you're, Jay Cutler, and you can barely put on another ounce of muscle because you're basically at your genetic limit, then sure. If you have, huge legs already and you're squatting, 405 for sets of 10, yeah, you're probably going to need some isolation work, okay? But if you can't squat 225 for 10 sets of 10, you probably don't need the isolation work yet. So squats are still good for hypertrophy right now, because you just need to get bigger in general. You don't need isolation work to bring up a specific muscle, okay? So, you can spend all this time, oh, I'm targeting my VMO, oh, I'm targeting my adductor, whatever. The problem with that, oh, I'm going to target my rectus femoris. You have skinny little legs already. So the squat is good for hypertrophy, especially for people who aren't already huge. And that's the point that I want to make here. So, are squats bad for hypertrophy? It's not a binary. For some people, it might not be an optimal movement. Some people might need isolation work because they're at that point in their career. They're at that point in their training age. But for other people, most people, in fact, the squat is great for hypertrophy, just like how deadlifts are great for hypertrophy, just like how bench press is great for hypertrophy, just like how overhead press is great for hypertrophy. Weighted pull-ups are great for hypertrophy. Weighted dips are great for hypertrophy, because you don't have any size yet. So, whenever you tell me you can strap on 150 pounds and bang out a set 10 and, weighted dips, yeah, maybe at that point it would make sense for you to do some very specific tricep work to try to get that nice, that, what do they call it, the horseshoe or whatever it is. But you're not at that point yet. Most of us aren't, and most of us will never even get there. So squats are good for hypertrophy for the majority of people, and yes, for some people, no, they're not. And then, as I pointed out earlier, even your injury history. Okay, if you have a low back injury or something, then maybe squats aren't a good choice for you because you can't load it heavy enough. Your legs aren't the limiting factor, your back is the limiting factor. So now you need to do something different in order to train your legs because you can't load your spine heavy enough, right? There are so many variables here. So making blanket statements like, oh, squats are bad for hypertrophy, It's a very stupid thing to say because you know full well that all these guys, all these huge bodybuilders, they built their mass in the beginning when they were first starting out. They built their mass doing big, heavy compound lifts like squats.